Bitter Creek Station's platform groaned under December ice, wind slicing through wool coats like a dull blade through leather. The surveying chain coiled cold in Ezra Stone's weathered hands, each government-calibrated link precise as scripture. Railroad Supervisor Garrett Mills held up Ezra's boundary report like evidence at a hanging. "Stone, your measurements are off by 3 degrees from company standard." His voice carried across the crowd of rail workers and townspeople. "We can't use a man who thinks precision matters more than progress." Laughter rippled through the gathering as Mills tossed the meticulously drafted survey into the frozen mud. The smell of coal smoke and nervous sweat hung thick in the December air. But Mercy Caldwell stepped forward, her voice cutting clean through the mockery. "Mr. Stone, I believe precision is exactly what my ranch needs." Mills sneered, tobacco juice dark against the snow. "Lady, hiring Stone will cost you more than cattle. It'll cost you your land." The warmth of Mercy Caldwell's kitchen fought a losing battle against December's bite. Coffee steamed from chipped ceramic cups, while Ezra Stone studied the land patents spread across her worn oak table. The smell of bacon grease and wood smoke couldn't quite mask the tension crackling between them like green logs on a fire. "Winter grazing permits expire February 15th, Mercy said, her finger tracing the territorial seal. "Every rancher in the valley has to file renewal claims with the territorial office in Denver." She pushed a stack of papers toward him. "These are Daddy's original boundary markers from 1878. Ezra lifted the documents carefully, noting the precise measurements inked in fading brown. "Your father was thorough, every corner marked to the quarter section." "Thorough don't matter if Cornelius Wade gets his way." Mercy's voice carried the edge of a woman who'd buried one man and wouldn't bury another dream. "He's been filing preliminary claims on disputed sections all winter, says the railroad needs expanded right-of-way for the Denver spur." Through the frost-etched window, Ezra could see Toby Marsh trudging through knee-deep snow toward the telegraph office, his breath puffing white in the bitter air. The distant sound of cattle lowing carried on the wind, animals that depended on these permits for legal winter grazing. "How many sections are we talking about?" Ezra asked. 3 full sections, maybe 4, depending on how generous Wade feels with other people's land." Mercy refilled his cup, her hands steady despite the weight of worry. "Territory won't recognize any survey that ain't certified by a railroad-approved surveyor." Ezra set down his cup with deliberate care. "And thanks to Mills, I ain't that anymore." "No, but you're still the most precise man in Colorado Territory." Her gray eyes met his across the table. "Wade's already filed preliminary claims on half the disputed sections." The wind howled through bare cottonwoods as Ezra uncoiled his surveying chain in Mercy's north pasture. Each link caught what little sunlight filtered through December clouds, the metal cold enough to burn skin through wool gloves, the smell of frozen earth and cattle dung mixed with the sharp bite of coming snow. "Government specification chain," Ezra said, demonstrating the proper technique. 66 feet exact, calibrated in Philadelphia and certified by the Territorial Surveyor's Office. He drove an iron stake into the hard ground with measured strikes, every link tested for accuracy. Mercy watched him work, her breath misting in the cold air. "Daddy always said measurement was the difference between owning land and just hoping you did." Ezra sighted through his compass, adjusting for magnetic declination with the practiced ease of 15 years' experience. The distant sound of a train whistle echoed off the mountains, the Denver and Rio Grande pushing west toward promises of silver and settlement. Your father was right. He noted the bearing in his field book, each numeral precise as a prayer. Law follows the chain, always has. He moved to the next station, paying out chain with mechanical precision. At the boundary corner, he knelt and brushed snow from a weathered wooden post. His gloved fingers traced the carved initials, J.C. 1878. "These government markers don't match Wade's filed boundaries," he said, straightening. "Not by 60 yards. Mercy's face went pale in the winter light. "What's that mean?" "Means either your father couldn't measure straight," Ezra said, "or Cornelius Wade's been filing fraudulent boundary claims with the territorial office." The wind picked up, rattling bare branches like old bones. In the distance, smoke rose from Wade's newly built surveyor's cabin, a man making himself at home on land that might not be his to claim. "Which do you reckon it is?" Mercy asked. Ezra coiled his chain with deliberate care, each loop falling into place with practiced precision. "I reckon we'd better find out before February 15th. The town hall reeked of wet wool and nervous sweat as half of Bitter Creek packed into wooden chairs that creaked under winter coats. Coal smoke from the potbelly stove couldn't cut the January chill that seeped through warped boards and rattled windows. Cornelius Wade stood at the front like a preacher delivering salvation, his black suit pressed sharp as a blade. "Gentlemen, ladies," Wade's voice carried the authority of Eastern money and railroad connections. "The Denver and Rio Grande has made their position clear." He held up an official-looking document, the territorial seal dark against cream paper. "Railroad expansion requires additional right-of-way through the Caldwell sections." Ezra sat in the back row beside Mercy, his surveying chain coiled quiet in his lap. The metal had warmed from his body heat, but the weight of it felt heavier with each word Wade spoke. "Now, I know some folks have concerns about property boundaries," Wade continued, his eyes finding Ezra's across the crowded room. "But the railroad has conducted their own survey using certified personnel." The emphasis on certified drew murmurs from the crowd. Mayor Harrison, a thin man who owned the hardware store, cleared his throat. "What about existing grazing permits? Some of these ranchers have been working this land for 20 years. Wade's smile was patient as a snake in sunshine. "Existing permits will be honored, naturally, within the corrected boundaries." He unrolled a large map across the wooden table, weighted down with brass paperweights. "As you can see, the territorial survey clearly shows the railroad's legal claim." Ezra leaned forward, studying the lines and measurements from the back of the room. The surveying work looked precise, professional, too precise. Every angle calculated to the minute, every bearing noted to the second. But something nagged at him like a splinter under skin. "Who conducted the survey?" Ezra called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. Wade's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Railroad personnel, as I mentioned, certified by the territorial government. I'd like to see the survey notes. I'm afraid that's proprietary railroad information." Wade's tone remained cordial, but ice crept around the edges. "Though I understand your professional interest, Mr. Stone?" The room fell silent except for the hiss of coal in the stove and the scratch of wind against glass. Mercy's hand found his arm, a quiet warning, but Ezra couldn't let it pass. "Every territorial survey is public record," he said. "Has been since statehood discussions started." Wade's smile never wavered. "The railroad has final say on all territorial surveys, and they've chosen their man." Judge Cornelius Morrison's office smelled of leather law books and stale pipe tobacco. January wind rattled the windows while the old man studied Wade's documents under a brass desk lamp. His weathered hands moved slowly through the pages, occasionally pausing to clean his spectacles. "Everything appears to be in order," Morrison said finally, setting the papers aside. "Railroad easement properly filed, survey conducted by certified personnel." Wade sat comfortably in the chair across from the judge's desk, his posture relaxed as a man who'd never doubted the outcome. Ezra stood near the window, Mercy beside him, both of them watching their legal options evaporate like steam from hot coffee. "Judge Morrison," Ezra said, "I'd like to examine the original survey notes. Compare them against the 1878 government markers." Morrison's gray eyes moved between Wade and Ezra like a man calculating odds. "On what grounds?" "Accuracy. The measurements don't align with existing territorial records." Wade leaned forward slightly. "Judge, I should mention that Mr. Stone's railroad employment was recently terminated. Questions arose regarding his reliability." The words hit like a physical blow. Ezra felt Mercy stiffen beside him, her breath sharp in the quiet office. The sound of horses moving past in the street seemed unnaturally loud. "Is that true, Stone?" Morrison asked. "Railroad supervisor said my measurements were too precise," Ezra replied. 3 degrees off company standard." "Company standard exists for good reasons," Wade interjected smoothly. "Excessive precision can delay progress, cost money. The railroad needs practical surveyors, not perfectionists." Morrison nodded slowly, the gesture of a man who'd heard similar complaints about difficult employees. "I see." "Judge," Ezra said, desperation creeping into his voice, "let me resurvey the disputed sections. Compare my measurements against Wade's. Truth will speak for itself." Wade's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. "I'm afraid that won't be necessary, Judge. The railroad survey is sufficient for territorial purposes." Morrison reached for his pipe, tamping tobacco with deliberate care. "Mr. Stone, Given the questions surrounding your professional standing, I'm declaring your surveying credentials questionable per railroad recommendation. The pipe smoke wreathed around the judge's head like incense at a funeral. Outside, a train whistle echoed off the mountains, the sound of progress rolling over everything in its path. Any survey Stone conducts will be legally inadmissible in territorial court. The general store buzzed with morning gossip and the smell of fresh coffee grinding. Sacks of flour and beans lined the wooden shelves while the potbelly stove fought January's bite. Mrs. Henderson paused mid-sentence when Mercy Caldwell walked through the door, Ezra Stone following close behind. "Morning, ladies," Mercy said, her voice carrying across the sudden quiet. She moved to the counter where bolt fabric lay stacked in neat rows, her boots clicking against worn floorboards. Sarah Mills, the railroad supervisor's wife, whispered something to her companion that made both women glance toward Ezra. He stood near the hardware section, studying a display of surveying equipment with professional interest. "Mercy, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone dripping false concern. "Are you certain about this arrangement? People are talking." "Let them." Mercy's fingers traced the edge of a blue calico bolt. "I need someone who measures truth, not convenience." The door chime announced another customer, Wade himself, brushing snow from his wool coat. His presence changed the store's atmosphere like a storm front moving in. Even the coffee grinder seemed to quiet its mechanical chatter. "Mrs. Caldwell," Wade tipped his hat politely. "Stone." The greeting carried less warmth. "Wade," Ezra nodded from across the store. "I trust you've given more thought to my offer?" Wade addressed Mercy directly. "The railroad's prepared to be quite generous for those disputed sections, more than fair market value." "Land ain't for sale," Mercy replied. "Never has been." Wade's smile remained fixed, but his eyes moved to Ezra. "Perhaps your consultant has advised you poorly. Sometimes an outside perspective lacks proper understanding of local realities." The other women watched like spectators at a prize fight. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shopping list while Sarah Mills' eyes darted between Wade and Mercy, calculating social advantages. "Stone understands plenty," Mercy said, her voice gaining steel. "He understands the difference between legal boundaries and wishful thinking." She turned to address the entire store, her voice carrying to every corner. "I'm hiring Ezra Stone to survey my property lines. Full survey, proper measurements, government specifications." The announcement hit the gathered women like a slap. Sarah Mills' mouth opened slightly while Mrs. Henderson's shopping list crumpled in her grip. Wade's composure never cracked. "I hope you understand the legal implications, Mrs. Caldwell. Disputed surveys can complicate permit renewals." "Then we'd best make sure the survey's accurate," Mercy replied. The telegraph office smelled of machine oil and burning kerosene. Copper wires hummed with distant conversations while Toby Marsh hunched over his key, transcribing messages with practiced efficiency. Ezra waited while the young operator finished a transmission to Denver, the brass key clicking like an impatient woodpecker. "Last batch came through this morning," Toby said, straightening from his work. 3 more territorial offices, same pattern. He pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle of telegraph carbons. "Take a look." Ezra studied the thin sheets, noting dates and destinations. The same measurements appeared repeatedly, identical coordinates filed in 3 different territorial offices, all bearing Wade's signature. "Leadville, Durango, Colorado Springs," Ezra read aloud. "Same survey data, same dates." The smell of carbon paper and ink filled his nostrils. Man would have to move mighty fast to survey 3 territories in 1 week. "Gets better," Toby said, excitement creeping into his voice. "Look at the timestamps." The telegraph records showed Wade filing claims in Leadville while simultaneously conducting surveys in Colorado Springs, impossible without the benefit of being in 2 places at once. "He's been sending identical land claims to 3 different territories," Toby continued. "Same dates, same measurements, like he's got one survey and he's using it everywhere." Through the window, Ezra could see Wade's office across the street, warm light spilling from the windows. A man working late, or a man with something to hide. "Question is," Ezra said, "which survey is real?" "Maybe none of them." Toby rewrapped the carbons carefully. "Maybe he's just filing paper and hoping nobody checks." The telegraph key started chattering again, another message coming in from somewhere down the line. Toby moved to transcribe it, his fingers dancing over the brass key in response. "What do you reckon we should do?" Toby asked over the mechanical noise. Ezra watched Wade's office through the frost, etched glass. The man was smart, connected, and careful. But smart men sometimes got careless when they thought they were winning. Keep collecting those carbons, Ezra said, and keep watching the timestamps. February wind howled through Bitter Creek's main street, rattling storefront signs and driving snow against frost-covered windows. The saloon's batwing doors swung constantly as men sought warmth and whiskey to cut the cold. Ezra pushed through the crowd, tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies thick in the overheated air. Wade stood at the bar, his black coat unbuttoned, holding court with half a dozen ranchers and townsmen. His voice carried above the general noise, smooth as aged whiskey. "Shame about Mrs. Caldwell," Wade was saying, swirling amber liquid in his glass. "Grief can make a woman susceptible to poor influences." The men around him nodded, faces flushed from alcohol and proximity to the cast-iron stove. Tom Bradley, who ran the livery stable, leaned closer to catch Wade's words. "What do you mean, Wade?" Bradley asked. "Well, a failed surveyor moving into a grieving widow's home." Wade let the implication hang like smoke in the air. "Unseemly, don't you think? Man with questionable professional ethics might have questionable personal ethics, too." Ezra's hands clenched around his whiskey glass. The amber liquid caught lamplight, trembling slightly with suppressed anger. Around him, conversations quieted as men sensed confrontation brewing like a summer storm. "Careful what you're suggesting, Wade," Ezra said, his voice cutting through the saloon noise. Wade turned slowly, his expression perfectly composed. "I'm not suggesting anything, Stone. Just observing that a woman alone might be grateful for male attention, even inappropriate attention." The words hit like a physical blow. Several men shifted uncomfortably while others watched with the hungry interest of spectators at a cockfight. The smell of spilled beer and sawdust couldn't mask the tension crackling between the two men. "You son of a—" Now. Wade raised his glass in mock salute. "No need for harsh words. I'm simply concerned for Mrs. Caldwell's reputation. A failed surveyor corrupting a grieving widow. The territorial government should investigate." Bradley and two other men exchanged meaningful glances, seeds planted, taking root in minds already suspicious of outsiders and change. "You're out of line," Ezra said. "Am I?" Wade's smile never wavered. "A man's reputation precedes him, Stone, and yours preceded you right out of railroad employment." The territorial clerk's office smelled of ink, paper dust, and bureaucratic indifference. February's bite leaked through single-pane windows while Clerk William Harrison shuffled through permit applications with methodical slowness. His pen scratched across official forms, each stroke deliberate as a judge's gavel. Wade sat across from the cluttered desk, his paperwork arranged in neat stacks. Every document bore official seals, proper signatures, measurements precise to the yard and rod, the perfect picture of legal compliance. "Forfeiture claim filed properly," Harrison said, his voice flat as weak old beer, "one day before permit expiration as territorial law requires." Mercy stood beside Ezra near the office door, her face pale but determined. Through the frost-etched window, they could see February snow accumulating on the courthouse steps where other ranchers waited for permit renewals. "Mr. Harrison," Mercy said, "I've been filing proper permits for 8 years. My paperwork's always been in order." "Previous permits were valid," Harrison agreed. "But boundary disputes change things. Railroad has filed conflicting claims on Sections 12, 13, and 14. Wade leaned forward slightly. "The railroad survey clearly shows encroachment on designated right-of-way. Mrs. Caldwell's cattle have been trespassing on railroad property." The words fell like axe blows. Ezra felt Mercy's sharp intake of breath, saw her hands clench at her sides. Outside, a train whistle echoed off the courthouse walls, the sound of progress rolling over individual lives. "That's impossible," Ezra said. "The original 1878 survey—" "Original survey has been superseded," Harrison interrupted, not looking up from his paperwork. "Railroad holds territorial authority for all right-of-way determinations." Wade produced another document, this one bearing the territorial seal and signed by officials in Denver. Corrected boundaries based on certified railroad survey. Mrs. Caldwell's previous permits covered land that legally belongs to the Denver and Rio Grande. Harrison examined the document with the same methodical attention he'd given everything else. His pen moved across fresh forms, filling in blanks with mechanical precision. "Based on corrected survey data," Harrison said, "Mrs. Caldwell's permits are void. Her cattle are trespassing on railroad property." The ink was still wet when he passed the forms across the desk. Official rejection stamped in red, territorial seal embossed at the bottom. 8 years of legal grazing rights erased with a bureaucrat's signature. Mercy took the papers with hands that barely trembled. How long do I have? Territorial law requires immediate cessation of trespassing activity where known. Harrison replied, cattle must be removed within 72 hours, or face impoundment. Wade stood, smoothing his coat with satisfied precision. The railroad regrets any inconvenience, Mrs. Caldwell. We're prepared to offer fair compensation for your misunderstanding. Through the window, Ezra could see other ranchers leaving with their renewed permits, relief evident in their postures. Men who'd bent to Wade's will, accepted his version of truth in exchange for another year's security. Mrs. Caldwell's permits are void, Harrison repeated, his voice carrying the weight of territorial law. Any attempt to graze cattle on disputed sections constitutes criminal trespass. Mercy's kitchen felt smaller with defeat sitting heavy at the table. Coffee had gone cold in their cups while the rejected permit forms lay spread between them like evidence of failure. February wind rattled the windows, driving snow against glass with the persistence of bad news. I won't let my presence destroy what your family built, Ezra said, his voice quiet as prayer. He pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against worn floorboards. Maybe Wade's right. Maybe I've brought you nothing but trouble. The smell of cooling coffee and wood smoke couldn't mask the bitter taste of surrender. Mercy's hands lay flat on the table, her wedding ring catching lamplight, a reminder of one man already lost to circumstances beyond control. So, you're just going to leave? Her voice carried the edge of a woman who'd buried one husband and wouldn't bury another dream. Let Wade win because some folks think poorly of us? I'm trying to protect you. Ezra moved to the window, watching snow accumulate on fence posts that might soon mark someone else's property. Your reputation, your standing in town, you lose those, you lose everything. I already lost everything once. Mercy's chair scraped as she stood. When consumption took my husband, when the bank tried to foreclose, when every man in town decided I was too weak to manage alone. Through the window, they could see Toby Marsh struggling through knee-deep snow toward the telegraph office, his breath puffing white in the bitter air. A young man with work to do, messages to send, connections to maintain between this isolated valley and the larger world. This land is all I have left of him, Mercy continued. All I have left of anything good in this world. You think I'm going to hand it to Cornelius Wade because he's got better lawyers and smoother words? Ezra turned from the window. What if fighting costs you more than losing? What if not fighting costs me everything worth keeping? The wind howled through bare cottonwoods, rattling branches like old bones. In the distance, cattle huddled against the storm, animals that depended on these disputed acres for winter survival. Wade's got the territorial government behind him, Ezra said. Railroad connections, legal authority. We've got one surveying chain and a pile of old papers. We've got the truth. Truth don't always win, Mercy. Sometimes it just gets you hurt. She moved closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, see the determination burning in her gray eyes. You planning to spend the rest of your life running from men like Wade? Moving from town to town, job to job, never putting down roots because someone might question your worth? The words hit home like well-aimed stones. Ezra had been running since the railroad fired him, maybe since long before that. Running from judgment, from the possibility of failure, from anything that required him to stand and fight for what mattered. I don't want to be the reason you lose this place. You won't be, Mercy said. Wade will be. Wade and his forged documents and his bought officials and his railroad connections that probably don't exist outside his own imagination. The north pasture lay buried under 2 feet of February snow, fence posts barely visible above the white expanse. Mercy led the way through drifts that reached their knees, her boots crunching through the frozen crust while wind cut through their wool coats like broken glass. Daddy always said winter was the best time to find permanent markers, she called over the wind. Snow shows you what's really there. They reached a cluster of bare cottonwoods where the fence line bent east toward the mountains. Mercy knelt beside the largest tree, brushing snow from its base with gloved hands. The smell of frozen earth and cattle dung mixed with the sharp bite of coming storm. Here, she said, her breath misting in the cold air. Daddy carved his initials in bedrock before he set the fence posts. Ezra knelt beside her, clearing snow until his fingers found carved stone beneath. Letters cut deep into granite. J.C. 1878. Below the initials, precise measurements marked in inches and degrees, the careful work of a man who understood that boundaries mattered. Original government survey marker, Mercy said. Daddy worked with the territorial surveyor when they first platted this valley. Every measurement certified and recorded in Denver. Ezra traced the carved numbers with his finger, feeling the permanent weight of stone and intention. Government specifications, properly marked, legally established, the kind of evidence that couldn't be forged or falsified. Wade's survey puts this marker 60 yards inside railroad right-of-way, he said. Daddy carved his initials in bedrock. Let's see Wade forge that. Sunday morning brought bitter cold and colder stares. The church bell's bronze voice rang across Bitter Creek, calling the faithful to worship and judgment in equal measure. Ezra and Mercy climbed the wooden steps together, their boots echoing against frost-covered boards, while parishioners filed past with carefully averted eyes. Inside, the sanctuary smelled of coal smoke and dampened wool. Families clustered in familiar pews while whispered conversations died as Ezra and Mercy found seats in the back. The silence felt thick as molasses, sweet with false piety and sharp with unspoken condemnation. Reverend Hayes took the pulpit with his usual measured dignity, his gray beard neatly trimmed and his sermon prepared. But even from the back pew, Ezra could see the preacher's discomfort, the way his eyes skipped over their corner of the church like a stone across water. Today's scripture comes from Matthew, Hayes began, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years behind this pulpit. Judge not, that ye be not judged. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Mrs. Henderson shifted in her pew while Tom Bradley examined his hymnal with sudden interest. Wade sat 3 rows ahead, his posture relaxed as a man who'd never doubted his welcome in God's house. Yet we live in a community, Hayes continued, where standards must be maintained, where propriety matters as much as charity. Mercy's hand found Ezra's, her fingers cold but steady. Around them, the congregation listened with the attention of people hearing their own thoughts spoken from sacred ground. A woman alone faces particular vulnerabilities, the preacher said, his words careful as a man walking on thin ice. The Christian community has a responsibility to guide those who might be led astray by circumstances. The meaning landed like a slap. Several parishioners turned to glance at Mercy and Ezra, their expressions ranging from pity to righteous disapproval. Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly, while Sarah Mills whispered something to her husband. After service, the congregation filed out with unusual haste. No one lingered to discuss the weather or exchange pleasantries. Even families who'd known Mercy for years found urgent reasons to hurry home through the February cold. Mrs. Caldwell, Reverend Hayes approached as they prepared to leave. His voice carried the weight of pastoral duty and personal regret. Perhaps it might be wise to consider your situation more carefully. The community's concerns aren't without merit. What concerns? Mercy asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. A woman of your standing, living alone with a man not her husband. Hayes cleared his throat. Even innocent arrangements can appear improper. So you're suggesting I send Mr. Stone away? I'm suggesting that appearances matter, Mrs. Caldwell, especially for a woman in your position. They walked home through streets that felt colder than February warranted. Even Reverend Hayes suggested maybe it's time to move along. The telegraph office hummed with mechanical energy as copper wires carried conversations across territorial distances. Toby Marsh hunched over his key, transcribing messages with practiced efficiency, while Ezra waited beside the coal stove. The smell of machine oil and burning kerosene mixed with the sharp scent of carbon paper. Got something interesting, Toby said, finishing a transmission to Denver. He pulled out a fresh bundle of telegraph carbons, his young face bright with discovery. Been tracking Wade's correspondence patterns for 3 weeks now. Ezra studied the thin sheets, noting destinations and timestamps. The pattern was becoming clearer. Too many messages to too many places, all carrying the same surveying data. Look at this one. Toby pointed to a carbon, dated 2 weeks earlier. Message to the Denver and Rio Grande headquarters signed by Wade, claiming authority to conduct territorial surveys on behalf of the railroad. Standard railroad business? That's what I thought, until this came through yesterday. Toby produced another carbon, this one bearing the railroad's official letterhead. Response from Denver headquarters. They've never heard of Cornelius Wade. The words hit like cold water. Ezra read the message twice, noting the formal language and official seal. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad had no record of employing Wade in any capacity, no authorization for him to conduct surveys, no knowledge of his territorial activities. His letterhead's fake, Ezra said, pieces falling into place like surveying stakes finding their proper positions. Wade's just another land grabber with good stationery. Through the window, they could see Wade's office across the street, warm light spilling from windows where a man worked late into the evening. But what kind of work required such secrecy, such careful deception? "There's more," Toby said, excitement building in his voice. "Been checking with other territorial offices, Leadville, Durango, Colorado Springs. Same pattern everywhere. Wade files claims, presents railroad credentials, gets official approval. Until someone checks with the actual railroad. Nobody ever checks. Why would they? Man has proper paperwork, official seals, measurements that look professional. Who's going to question the Denver and Rio Grande?" Ezra studied the carbon copies, noting the careful forgery of railroad letterhead and the precision of Wade's deception. A man smart enough to know that bureaucrats rarely verified credentials, bold enough to impersonate a major corporation, careful enough to maintain the fiction for months. "Question is," Toby said, "what do we do with this information?" Outside, snow began falling again, thick flakes that would cover tracks and blur boundaries. Wade's lamp still burned in his office window, a man working late or a man with secrets to protect. "We take it to Judge Morrison," Ezra said. "Show him what a real railroad survey looks like." March brought the first hint of thaw, but the weight of winter still pressed heavy on Bitter Creek. Ezra sat alone in Mercy's kitchen, staring at the telegraph carbons spread across the table like accusations waiting for a courtroom. Coffee had gone cold in his cup while doubt gnawed at him like hunger that wouldn't quit. The evidence was clear. Wade's railroad connections were fraudulent, his surveys forged, his territorial authority non-existent, but evidence meant nothing if no one would listen, and Judge Morrison had already declared Ezra's professional standing questionable. The smell of coffee grounds and wood smoke couldn't mask the bitter taste of defeat settling in his mouth like ashes. Outside, he could hear Mercy talking with Tom Bradley near the barn, their voices carrying on the warming air. The livery stable owner had come to collect his horses, animals he'd been boarding on her land for 2 years, now suddenly unwelcome because of rumors and reputation. "I understand your position, Mrs. Caldwell," Bradley was saying, his voice stiff with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. "But my wife feels uncomfortable with our current arrangement." "Uncomfortable about what, Tom? The horses have been happy here. You said so yourself last month." "It's not about the horses." The admission came like a confession in church. "It's about appearances, what folks are saying about you and Stone." Through the window, Ezra watched the conversation unfold with the sick fascination of watching a house burn. Bradley shuffled his feet in the muddy yard, unable to meet Mercy's eyes. Behind him, his 2 bay mares stood patient in their halters, animals caught in the middle of human foolishness. "What exactly are folks saying, Tom?" "You know what they're saying, about Stone living here, about the 2 of you, carrying on. Sarah Mills thinks it's scandalous. Mrs. Henderson says it reflects poorly on the whole community." Mercy's voice carried the edge of a woman pushed past patience. "And what do you think, Tom?" "I think," Bradley paused, wrestling with conscience and social pressure. "I think a woman's got a right to make her own choices. But I also think my wife's got a right to her opinions, and she don't want our horses associated with whatever this is." The kitchen door opened, bringing the scent of warming earth and Mercy's boots on the wooden floor. She hung her coat on the peg by the door, her movements careful as someone handling fragile things that might shatter. "Tom's taking his horses to the livery," she said, not meeting Ezra's eyes. "Says his wife doesn't approve of our situation." Ezra pushed the telegraph carbons aside, suddenly weary of evidence and proof in the whole machinery of justice that seemed designed to protect men like Wade while punishing everyone else. How many others? What? How many other folks are pulling back, withdrawing their business, their friendship, their support, because I'm here? Mercy poured herself coffee from the pot, her movements deliberate as ritual. "Does it matter? It matters if it's costing you everything you've worked for. It matters if fighting Wade means losing the community you've lived with for 8 years. She sat across from him, her gray eyes reflecting the weight of choices that had no good answers. "Mrs. Henderson canceled her order for winter vegetables, says she can get what she needs from Denver. The Andersons won't be sending their boy for riding lessons anymore." Each name hit like a physical blow. These were people who'd known Mercy since she'd arrived as a young bride, who'd attended her husband's funeral, who'd accepted her as part of Bitter Creek's fabric. Now they were cutting those threads one by one because of him. Maybe Wade was right from the beginning, Ezra said, the words tasting like poison. Maybe precision doesn't matter if nobody wants to see the truth. Maybe fighting corruption just makes you another casualty in someone else's war. So you're giving up? I'm facing facts. We've got evidence Wade's a fraud, but no judge will hear it from me. We've got proof his surveys are forged, but the territorial government believes his paperwork over our measurements. We've got truth on our side, and it ain't worth spit against his connections. Mercy's hands wrapped around her coffee cup like she was trying to absorb its warmth. I should go, Ezra continued, the words heavy as lead in his mouth. Pack my surveying gear, find another town, another job, let you rebuild your reputation without me dragging it down. Where would you go? Denver, maybe. Colorado Springs. Plenty of territory that needs surveying. And when the next Cornelius Wade shows up, when the next railroad supervisor decides your measurements are too precise, you planning to run again? The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Outside, they could hear Tom Bradley leading his horses away, hoofbeats fading into the distance like promises unkept. The sound of another connection severed, another bridge burned. Maybe running's what I do best, Ezra said. Maybe I was a fool to think I could put down roots anywhere. Some men are meant to drift. That's the biggest load of horseshit I've ever heard. The profanity startled him. Mercy wasn't given to crude language, but anger had stripped away her usual careful speech. You think running away fixes anything? You think giving Wade what he wants makes the world better? I think trying to fight him has cost you more than the land's worth. You don't get to decide what my land's worth to me. Her voice carried the steel of a woman who'd buried one man and wouldn't bury another dream. This place is all I have left of my husband, all I have left of anything good in this world. You think I'm going to hand it to Wade because some small-minded folks can't see past their own prejudices? The March thaw revealed what winter had hidden. Water trickled from melting snow, creating muddy streams that carved new channels through the valley floor. The air smelled of warming earth and possibilities, but tension stretched between Ezra, Mercy, and Toby as they stood at the boundary marker where granite met mathematics. Every measurement matches the government survey from 1878, Ezra said, checking his notes against the carved figures. His surveying chain lay coiled beside the marker, each link catching pale sunlight like promises of precision. Your father's work was perfect. Government specification to the inch. Toby held up fresh telegraph carbons, his young face bright with discovery despite the weight of what they revealed. Denver office confirmed it again this morning. No Cornelius Wade on railroad payroll, no authorization for territorial surveys, no knowledge of his activities. Man's been impersonating a major corporation for months. Mercy knelt beside her father's marker, her fingers tracing the carved initials like a blessing or a prayer. J.C. 1878. The letters cut deep in granite that would outlast them all. Daddy would have fought, she said quietly. He'd never have let someone steal what he built with honest work and careful measurement. Around them, the valley showed signs of spring's approach, birds returning from wherever birds spent the winter, cattle moving restlessly in distant pastures, new grass pushing through winter's decay, life returning, renewing, refusing to stay buried under snow and doubt. Problem is getting anyone to listen, Ezra said, studying the evidence spread before them like a court case waiting for justice. Morrison won't hear testimony from me. Wade's got the territorial government convinced, and half the town thinks we're improper. More than half, Mercy said with bitter honesty. Tom Bradley was just the beginning. Others will follow once word spreads. The wind carried the sound of cattle lowing in distant pastures, animals that needed spring grass and legal permits to survive another season. Time was running short, permits expired in 10 days, and Wade's forfeiture claims would become permanent without intervention. There's one way, Toby said, excitement building in his voice despite the odds stacked against them. Public demonstration. Make Wade prove his survey in front of the whole town. He'll never agree to that, Ezra said. He will if we frame it right. Challenge his professional competence in public, question his railroad authority where everyone can hear. Man like Wade can't back down from a challenge without looking weak, and his whole scheme depends on appearing strong. Through the warming air, they could see smoke rising from Wade's office chimney, a man working even on Sunday, maintaining his careful deception. But deception required constant effort, constant vigilance, while truth only required measurement and the courage to speak it. Spring thaw reveals property markers, Ezra said, understanding dawning like sunrise over the mountains. Wade's been lying about everything, but lies wash away when the snow melts. The town square buzzed with curiosity and the smell of fresh coffee from the general store. Word had spread through Bitter Creek like wildfire. Ezra Stone was challenging Cornelius Wade to a public demonstration of surveying skill. Half the town gathered despite the morning chill, their breath misting in air that carried the promise of spring but still bit with winter's teeth. Wade stood near the courthouse steps, his black coat immaculate and his surveying instruments arranged with military precision. A brass theodolite gleamed in the pale sunlight, its lenses and angles speaking of Eastern money and professional competence. His chain-bearer, a young man imported from Denver, waited with obvious nervousness. "Gentlemen, ladies," Wade addressed the crowd with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his welcome anywhere. "I appreciate Mr. Stone's enthusiasm for public demonstration, though I confess surprise at his willingness to have his methods examined so closely." Ezra knelt beside his surveying chain, checking each link for wear or damage. The government-certified metal had served him faithfully for 15 years, through territories and disputes and measurements that mattered to people's lives. Beside him, Toby Marsh held the telegraph carbons that would serve as evidence when the surveying was done. Judge Morrison stood on the courthouse steps, his gray hair catching morning light and his expression suggesting a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Territorial law requires accurate boundary determination," he announced to the crowd. "Both surveyors will measure the disputed section. Results will be compared against official records." The smell of horses and leather mixed with nervous sweat as townspeople formed a rough circle around the survey area. Tom Bradley stood with his wife near the general store, their faces carefully neutral. Mrs. Henderson whispered something to Sarah Mills that made both women nod approvingly. "Mr. Wade," Morrison continued, "as the recognized railroad surveyor, you'll demonstrate first." Wade's smile never wavered. "Of course, Your Honor. Your Honor, happy to show proper surveying technique." He moved to the starting point with theatrical precision, his movements calculated to impress spectators who understood little about surveying but recognized authority when they saw it. The theodolite was positioned with elaborate care, its brass fittings catching sunlight like jewelry. "Beginning at territorial marker 17, Wade announced, bearing north by northeast, distance to be determined by chain measurement." His assistant began paying out chain while Wade peered through the theodolite's eyepiece, making minute adjustments with the precision of a watchmaker. The crowd watched in respectful silence as he called out bearings and distances, each measurement recorded in his leather-bound field book. But Ezra noticed something wrong. Wade's chain-bearer was paying out links too quickly, not allowing for proper tension. The measurements looked precise from a distance, but precision required more than brass instruments and confident announcements. "Bearing adjusted for magnetic declination, which is saw," Wade called out. "Distance recorded as 53 rods, 14 links." Applause rippled through the crowd. Wade's demonstration had looked professional, authoritative, exactly what people expected from a railroad-certified surveyor. Even Ezra had to admit the man knew how to put on a show. "Mr. Stone," Morrison said, "your turn." Ezra rose slowly, his surveying chain coiled in weathered hands that had learned their trade through years of careful practice. No brass instruments, no imported assistance, just government-certified chain, and the knowledge that precision mattered more than performance. "Beginning at the same marker," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Chain measurement to establish true distance and bearing." He paid out chain with methodical care, each link properly tensioned, each measurement verified before moving forward. Toby followed with the field book, recording numbers that would stand scrutiny in any territorial court. The crowd watched with less enthusiasm than they'd shown Wade. Ezra's method looked mundane, workmanlike, lacking the theatrical flair that impressed people who didn't understand the difference between showmanship and skill. But the numbers didn't lie. When Ezra reached the end point, his measurement differed from Wade's by nearly 60 yards, exactly the discrepancy he'd discovered weeks earlier at Mercy's boundary marker. 58 rods, 6 links, Ezra announced, bearing north-northeast, adjusted for proper magnetic declination. The difference was significant enough that even non-surveyors could see it. Murmurs spread through the crowd as people realized one of the measurements had to be wrong. "Chain don't lie, Wade," Ezra said, his voice carrying the authority of mathematical certainty. "Your boundaries are 60 yards off government specification." The territorial inspector arrived on the noon train, his official credentials and government-issued surveying equipment adding weight to the proceedings. Inspector James Crawford was a thin man with steel-gray hair and the methodical manner of someone who'd spent decades resolving boundary disputes across the territory. "Gentlemen," Crawford said, setting up his own instruments near the disputed marker, "I'll conduct an independent survey using territorial standards. Results will be compared against both your measurements and original government records." The crowd had grown throughout the morning. News of the surveying contest had drawn people from neighboring ranches and settlements, all curious to see Wade's authority challenged publicly. Even Reverend Hayes had come, his presence lending moral weight to the proceedings. Crawford's survey took 2 hours of meticulous work. Unlike Wade's theatrical demonstration, or Ezra's workmanlike precision, the territorial inspector moved with bureaucratic thoroughness, checking and rechecking every measurement against government standards. When finished, he consulted the original 1878 survey records that Toby had retrieved from the territorial archives. The documents bore official seals and the signature of the territorial surveyor who'd originally platted the valley. "Mr. Stone's measurements," Crawford announced, "align exactly with the original government survey. Mr. Wade's measurements show significant discrepancies, approximately 60 yards in distance, 3 degrees in bearing." The words hit the crowd like thunder. Wade's face remained composed, but something flickered behind his eyes, the first crack in his carefully maintained facade. "Furthermore," Crawford continued, producing the telegraph carbons that Toby had gathered, "investigation reveals that Mr. Wade has no authorization from the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad to conduct territorial surveys." The inspector's voice carried across the suddenly quiet square. "These documents show that Mr. Wade has been impersonating railroad personnel and filing fraudulent claims in multiple territorial offices." Wade's composure finally cracked. "Inspector, I assure you there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Crawford interrupted. "The railroad confirms they have no employee named Cornelius Wade. Your letterhead is forged, your credentials fabricated, your territorial authority non-existent." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. People who deferred to Wade's supposed railroad connections now saw him for what he was, a common land grabber with clever forgeries and persuasive lies. "Cornelius Wade," Crawford said, his voice carrying the weight of territorial law, "you're under arrest for defrauding the territorial government and filing false claims against private property." 2 deputies who'd arrived with the inspector moved forward, their intentions clear. Wade looked around the square, seeing faces that had once shown respect, now reflecting anger and betrayal. "This is preposterous," Wade protested as the deputies approached. "I have connections, influence. The railroad will vouch for me." "The railroad already has," Crawford replied. "They've never heard of you." The handcuffs clicked shut with metallic finality. Wade's carefully constructed empire of lies collapsed in a single moment of mathematical precision and bureaucratic thoroughness. As the deputies led Wade away, Mercy stepped forward from the crowd. Her voice carried clearly across the square as she addressed Judge Morrison directly. "Your Honor, I believe my grazing permits need to be restored." Morrison nodded, his expression mixing relief with embarrassment. "Mrs. Caldwell, the court apologizes for the error. Your permits will be reissued immediately based on the correct boundary survey." The territorial clerk's office smelled different this time. Less of bureaucratic indifference, more of spring air flowing through open windows. William Harrison shuffled through paperwork with the same methodical precision he'd shown weeks earlier, but his attitude had transformed completely. The man who'd dismissed Mercy's claims now treated her with the deference due someone who'd been wronged by official incompetence. "Mrs. Caldwell," Harrison said, his pen scratching across fresh permit forms, "the territorial government extends its sincere apologies for the irregularities in your case." He blotted the ink carefully, each movement deliberate as a ritual of restoration. "Your grazing permits are hereby restored to their original boundaries, with compensation for lost time and inconvenience." Mercy sat across from his desk, Ezra beside her, both of them still adjusting to the sudden reversal of fortune. Through the open window, they could hear birds returning from winter exile, their songs mixing with the sound of wagon wheels on muddy streets and the general bustle of a town shaking off winter's grip. "What about the other ranchers?" Mercy asked, "the ones who accepted Wade's reduced boundaries?" Harrison consulted another stack of documents, his expression growing more uncomfortable with each page. 7 other properties were affected by fraudulent boundary adjustments. All permits will be corrected and reissued based on original government surveys. The scope of Wade's deception was becoming clear. a systematic scheme to defraud multiple landowners through falsified railroad credentials and manufactured authority. Only the accident of Mercy's resistance and Ezra's precision had brought the whole structure tumbling down. And Wade himself? Ezra asked. Territorial prison, 2 years minimum, grand larceny, fraud against the government, impersonation of railroad officials. Harrison's voice carried satisfaction as he enumerated the charges. He'll have plenty of time to consider the consequences of his actions. Outside, a train whistle echoed off the courthouse walls, the real Denver and Rio Grande, not Wade's fictional version. The sound that had once represented threat and displacement now seemed like promise, like the possibility of legitimate progress built on honest foundations. There's also the matter of restitution, Harrison continued, producing yet another document. Wade's assets are being liquidated to compensate affected parties. Your share should cover any losses incurred during the permit dispute. Mercy studied the figures, noting amounts that would restore her financial stability, and then some. Justice measured in dollars and cents, bureaucratic acknowledgement that wrong had been done and must be made right. Mrs. Caldwell's permits are hereby restored, Harrison announced formally, pressing the territorial seal into warm wax. With apologies for the error, April sunshine warmed the valley floor as Ezra and Mercy walked the restored boundaries of her land. Spring grass pushed through winter-killed turf while meadowlarks called from fence posts that now marked legally secure property lines. The air smelled of warming earth and possibilities, of a world renewing itself after months of cold and doubt. Ezra's surveying chain coiled neat in his hands, the familiar weight of precision and certainty. He'd measured these boundaries 3 times now, once in defiance, once in desperation, once in vindication. Each measurement had told the same truth, but only now did anyone want to hear it. Still measuring? Mercy asked, though her smile suggested she already knew the answer. Habit, Ezra admitted, kneeling beside the granite marker where her father's initials proclaimed permanent ownership. Want to make sure Wade's lies haven't somehow shifted the bedrock. Cattle grazed in the distance. Animals that could now eat spring grass without fear of trespass charges or forfeiture claims. Legal grazing on legally owned land, simple concepts that had required months of struggle to establish. Tom Bradley came by yesterday, Mercy said, settling beside him on ground that felt solid as mathematical certainty. Wants to bring his horses back. His wife suddenly discovered that appearances matter less than good pasture. And what did you tell him? That his horses are welcome. His wife's opinions about propriety can stay home. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their world rebuild itself around the framework of restored truth. The valley stretched before them, green with promise and legally theirs to enjoy. In the distance, smoke rose from chimneys where neighbors who'd shunned them were now reconsidering their positions. Reverend Hayes wants to apologize, Mercy continued. Says he let community pressure override Christian charity. Wants to know if we'll be back for Sunday service. Will we? I reckon we will. Can't let folks think we hold grudges just because they were wrong about everything. A train whistle sounded from the direction of Bitter Creek Station, the same sound that had once carried threat and displacement. Now it spoke of legitimate commerce, honest progress, the kind of development that respected existing rights instead of trampling them. Inspector Crawford offered me a job, Ezra said, the words surprising even himself. Territorial Surveyor's Office needs someone who understands the difference between precision and performance. Mercy's hand found his, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. Denver? Based here in Bitter Creek. Seems the territory's discovered it needs someone to verify railroad surveys before they become official policy. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Wade's attempted fraud had created the very position that would prevent future frauds. Truth emerging stronger from its temporary defeat, like spring grass pushing through winter's debris. Good work if you can get it, Mercy said. Steady work, government wages, territorial authority, the kind of credentials no railroad supervisor can question. Ezra paused, considering the implications. Means putting down roots, real roots, the kind that don't pull up when trouble comes. And when the next Cornelius Wade shows up, when the next crisis tests whether those roots will hold. Ezra studied the valley that had become home through struggle and vindication. Land measured precisely, boundaries established permanently, truth proven through mathematical certainty. This place had tested him, nearly broken him, then rebuilt him into something stronger. Then we'll measure truth against lies, he said. Same as we did this time. Chain don't lie, and precision matters, whether folks want to see it or not. Mercy leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm and real as surveyed boundaries. Some measurements are worth defending with everything you have. Around them, the valley hummed with spring activity, birds building nests, cattle grazing legal grass, neighbors resuming relationships that had been interrupted by fear and misunderstanding. Life returning to patterns that had been disrupted but not destroyed. "Reckon we'll be measuring out a life together," Ezra said, the words carrying the weight of promise and precision. "One accurate step at a time. Long as you don't mind if I help with the measuring. Wouldn't have it any other way." They sat until the sun reached its zenith, two people who'd found each other through crisis and chosen to stay together through resolution. The surveying chain lay coiled between them, government-certified and battle-tested, ready for whatever measurements the future might require. In the distance, Bitter Creek went about its business of rebuilding trust and reconsidering judgments. Some boundaries, they'd learned, were more important than others. Some measurements mattered more than convenience or comfort, or the opinions of people who'd never held a surveying chain. Truth, once properly measured and legally established, had a permanence that no amount of fraud or pressure could disturb. Like granite markers carved deep in bedrock, like spring grass pushing through winter's decay, like love built on honest foundations. Some things, once established, endured. Spring came to Bitter Creek like truth, slow, certain, changing everything it touched. Ezra Stone stood at the north boundary marker, his surveying chain coiled neat in weathered hands, watching Mercy's cattle graze on grass their precision had preserved. The old-timers said land was about luck and timing, but Ezra knew better. Land was about measurement, about knowing exactly where you stood and defending that ground with mathematical certainty. Wade had learned that the hard way, serving 2 years territorial prison for fraud while his forged documents moldered in evidence files. Mercy approached through the morning mist, her boots sure on ground they'd fought to keep. "Measuring again?" she asked, though her smile said she already knew. "Habit," Ezra admitted. "Want to make sure our boundaries haven't shifted overnight." "Some boundaries don't need measuring," she said, taking his free hand. "Some things you just know." By God's mercy, Ezra thought, she was right. Love wasn't about angles and distances. It was about two people choosing to stand together when the whole world tried to move them apart. Precision mattered in surveying, but in living, what mattered was the heart's true compass. The territorial surveyor's badge in his pocket caught morning light, official recognition of skills that had never been in question. Wade's deception had created the very position designed to prevent future deceptions, truth emerging stronger from temporary defeat. Children would grow up in this valley knowing their parents' land was measured true and held secure. Neighbors would rebuild trust on foundations of honest dealing. The railroad would come eventually, but it would follow legitimate surveys and respect existing rights. The dust had finally settled on their troubles, and what remained was simple: good land, honest work, and a woman who'd seen worth in a man the world called too careful, too precise, too much. Some measurements, he reckoned, were worth defending with everything you had.